Inside the fortress walls of Unit 731, the machinery of secrecy turned ceaselessly. What began as General Shiro Ishii's vision had now become a sprawling network of laboratories, prison blocks, and execution chambers, a place where science no longer answered to humanity, but to the Empire. But to make this machine function, Ishii needed men willing to abandon the oath of medicine, and he found them. Doctors, surgeons, microbiologists, chemists, educated men from some of Japan's finest universities were recruited with promises of prestige, power, and the chance to advance in their careers without restriction. They were told they were serving their emperor, defending their nation, and pushing the boundaries of medical science. Many accepted eagerly, others hesitated, but the weight of nationalism, loyalty, and fear pushed them through the gates. Soon, the compound at Harbin became a hub of activity. White-coated scientists moved briskly between brick buildings. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter. Trains rattled in under cover of night, unloading their cargo of new logs. From the outside, it looked like discipline. Inside, it was a descent into moral chaos. The scientists divided the prisoners according to the experiments planned for them. Some were herded into cells for disease studies. Others were locked away for surgical practice. A select few were taken to underground chambers where the most secret tests were conducted. And then the experiments began. At first, the focus was on infectious disease. Ishii wanted to weaponize nature itself, so prisoners were injected with pathogens: plague, anthrax, typhus, cholera. Scientists observed how long it took for symptoms to appear, how the body reacted, how death crept in. They meticulously recorded fevers, convulsions, organ failure, until the log went still. When one body was gone, another was brought in. The work continued. But Ishii's ambitions went further. He wanted to know not just how diseases killed, but how they spread. Prisoners were placed in sealed chambers filled with infected fleas. Others were tied to stakes in open fields while planes dropped plague-infested bombs above them, their screams muffled by the roar of engines. Survivors were monitored until they too succumbed. Villages outside the compound were deliberately infected to track how epidemics moved through populations. The cruelty was not hidden from those who carried it out. It was systematized, sterilized by language. The prisoners weren't human beings, they were test material. And once the doctors accepted that lie, there were no limits. Vivisections followed. Prisoners were cut open without anesthesia so that organs could be studied while still functioning. Lungs, livers, hearts were observed in real time, the rhythm of life giving way to silence under the surgeon's knife. Frostbite tests left men, women, and children with their limbs exposed to the icy Manchurian winds, then thawed in boiling water to measure tissue damage. Weapons were tested on living bodies: grenades, flamethrowers, even bayonets. And all of it was meticulously documented. Charts, photographs, reports. Unit 731 was not chaos. It was order. The cold, efficient order of death disguised as science. Outside the walls, whispers grew. Local Chinese farmers spoke of trains that went in full and came out empty. They spoke of the black smoke that sometimes rose from the compound's chimneys. They spoke of guards who warned them never to come too close, never to ask questions. But no one outside truly knew the scale of what was happening. And those inside who did know, the doctors, the scientists, the soldiers, said nothing. Some believed they were serving their country. Others told themselves it was necessary, that in war morality could not survive. And some,
chillingly, seemed to take satisfaction in the work itself. In the shadows of Manchuria, Unit 731 had crossed the point of no return. What had begun as a secret project to protect soldiers from disease had become a machine of human experimentation on an industrial scale. General Ishii was pleased. His fortress was functioning. His men were producing results, and the Empire, watching from afar, began to realize that they now possessed a weapon unlike any other. The world had no idea, but inside the brick walls of Harbin, the war without humanity was only just beginning.
Inside Unit 731, the word human was forbidden. Prisoners were logs, flesh and bone reduced to mere material. It was this deliberate erasure of identity that allowed what came next. Experiments so cruel, so methodical, that they remain almost unimaginable. The cell blocks were crowded, dim, and silent, except for the shuffle of bare feet and the barked orders of guards. Prisoners came from every corner of occupied China. Farmers suspect of helping resistance fighters, students accused of disloyalty, merchants, beggars, entire families sometimes taken in the night. There were also Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, even Allied prisoners of war who had fallen into Japanese hands. None would leave alive. The first stage was disease. General Ishii's obsession with microbiology meant countless logs were infected deliberately. Doctors in crisp white coats carried syringes filled with pathogens: plague, anthrax, cholera, typhus. Prisoners were injected and locked in cells while scientists peered through small windows to watch their bodies betray them. Fevers raged, skin erupted in sores, internal organs swelled until they ruptured. Some screamed in agony, others drifted into delirium, and every stage of their suffering was recorded with meticulous detail. Temperatures logged, heart rates measured, stool and blood samples collected. The body became a textbook, the prisoner a living page. Others were exposed not by injection, but by environment. Prisoners were sealed into chambers filled with infected fleas. They clawed at their skin as the insects bit, as diseases entered their bloodstreams. Some were strapped to stakes in fields, their arms spread, while Japanese planes released plague-infested bombs overhead. Those who survived the blast faced an invisible enemy, infection spreading through their veins. And when death came, the story did not end, because for Ishii's scientists, the most valuable data came from the living. Vivisections were performed on prisoners without anesthesia. Doctors sliced open chests to watch lungs breathe. They exposed beating hearts, pumping blood until the final moment. They cut into stomachs and intestines, observing digestion as it happened. They amputated limbs, then reattached them in crude ways to study circulation. The victims screamed, thrashed, begged, but their cries were met only with the scratching of pens on clipboards. In the frostbite experiments, guards marched prisoners outside during Manchuria's brutal winters. Arms and legs were exposed until they froze solid. Then the subjects were forced to plunge the frozen limbs into boiling water, the skin sloughing off in sheets. Others had their flesh struck with sticks to test when it sounded like wood.
The results were written down, another line in another report. Weapons were tested here too. Grenades strapped to bodies to measure blast patterns, flamethrowers ignited against bound prisoners, bayonets and swords driven into live targets while soldiers practiced technique. Pregnant women were not spared. Some were deliberately infected with diseases to study transmission to the fetus. Newborn infants were dissected moments after birth, their lives extinguished before they began. The cruelty was staggering, but what made it worse was the orderliness of it all. These were not acts of rage or chaos. They were organized, scheduled, and justified as research. The scientists convinced themselves it was necessary for the empire's survival. Some even convinced themselves it was honorable work. The prisoners, stripped of names, stripped of dignity, had no voice. Their suffering vanished into piles of data, their bodies into smoke rising from the incinerators. And yet, whispers did escape. Locals in Harbin saw the trains arrive, packed with people. They saw them leave empty. Farmers saw strange clouds drifting over fields, after which entire villages sickened and died. They saw soldiers burn the bodies, bury the ashes, and erase the evidence. But the full truth would not be known until decades later. For now, inside the fortress of Unit 731, the suffering continued, day after day, night after night. Thousands of prisoners entered the gates. None returned. And in the minds of Ishii and his men, each death was not a crime, but progress.
By the early 1940s, the fortress at Harbin was no longer just a laboratory. It had become the beating heart of an invisible army. An army made not of soldiers, but of microbes, fleas, and pathogens, all carefully cultivated to kill by the millions. General Shiro Ishii's ambitions had outgrown the walls of Unit 731. He wanted to prove that his work could change the battlefield itself. Not just experiments on prisoners in cells, but experiments on entire populations. And so Japan began to turn the Chinese countryside into a living laboratory. Trains departed the Harbin complex under the cover of night, carrying ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas. Aircraft were loaded with canisters of cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. Entire squads of the Kwantung Army were trained to deploy these weapons discreetly, sometimes disguised as routine operations. Villages in Zhejiang, Hunan, and Shandong provinces became test sites. From the sky, Japanese planes dropped plague-ridden grain and fleas onto farmlands. Children playing in fields, farmers tending their crops, families drawing water from wells, none knew that death was falling silently around them. Within days, sickness spread like wildfire. Bodies weakened by fever and vomiting lay in huts, in fields, in the streets. Villages that had thrived for generations became graveyards overnight. The scale was staggering. Entire rivers were poisoned with cholera bacteria, turning lifelines into death traps. Thousands perished not from bullets or bombs, but from water they drank, food they ate, air they breathed. And the Japanese army watched. Ishii's scientists followed in the wake of the devastation, entering infected villages to measure the results. They recorded how many days before the first deaths,
how quickly disease spread through families, how long before a village collapsed entirely. Then they left the dead unburied, burning homes to hide their tracks, and moved on to the next target. But Unit 731's ambitions didn't stop at China. There were whispers of grander plans, releasing plague fleas into the Soviet Union if Japan advanced west, or even attacking American cities with biological weapons carried by long-range balloons. Ishii boasted that with the power of disease, Japan could win a war without firing a single bullet. Inside Harbin, the experiments intensified. Prisoners were deliberately infected in one wing of the compound, while bombs filled with bacteria were tested in another. Rats and fleas were bred by the millions, stored in cages stacked to the ceiling, ready to be unleashed. Scientists debated methods of dispersal, airdrops, artillery shells, covert contamination of supplies. Each new idea meant more victims, more experiments, more logs consumed in the pursuit of data. For the men and women trapped inside Unit 731, this escalation meant an endless cycle of death. Frostbite tests continued in the brutal Manchurian winter. Flamethrower experiments scorched the walls black. Surgical practice was carried out with the same cold detachment as dissecting a frog in a school laboratory. The cruelty seeped beyond the compound. In villages near Harbin, farmers noticed sudden outbreaks of disease. Children wasted away with fevers that no medicine could treat. Whole communities vanished within weeks. Those who survived spoke in whispers about the devil's fortress to the north, about the black smoke rising from chimneys, about the soldiers who left bodies in mass graves. For Ishii, it was proof of success. In reports to Tokyo, he boasted of breakthroughs, of data unmatched anywhere in the world. While Allied scientists worked under the limits of ethics, Japan was free to push forward unchecked, producing results at a speed no other nation could match. To the empire, Unit 731 was not a crime. It was a weapon, a tool to be sharpened, hidden, and unleashed when the time was right. But as Japan's war effort faltered in the Pacific, Ishii realized his grand vision was slipping away. By 1945, Allied forces were pushing back island by island, and Soviet armies loomed on the borders of Manchuria. The dream of conquering Asia with biological warfare was dying. And in Harbin, panic began to spread. Not among the prisoners, their fate was already sealed, but among the doctors and officers who feared what would happen if the world discovered what they had done. The war without humanity was ending, and the men of Unit 731 were about to make sure that their fortress left no trace.
In August 1945, the walls of Unit 731 shook with the sound of a crumbling empire. The bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's once unstoppable military machine was shattered, and in Manchuria, the Soviet Red Army was advancing with terrifying speed. Inside the fortress at Harbin, panic gripped the men who had carried out years of unspeakable experiments. The empire they had served was collapsing. The war was lost, and the fortress they had built, this hidden laboratory of death, was about to be exposed. General Shiro Ishii gave the order, "Erase everything." Prisoners were marched into courtyards and executed en masse. Gunshots echoed through the cell blocks as guards emptied their rifles into rows of terrified men, women, and children. Others were burned alive inside their barracks, their screams swallowed by the crackle of fire.
The living logs who remained were slaughtered, their bodies thrown into pits, their names, already erased, lost forever. Laboratories were dismantled in haste. Documents were burned in great piles, the smoke rising high above the walls. Glass vials were smashed, cages of infected fleas and rats incinerated. Incinerators worked night and day to destroy the evidence of years of crimes. By the time Soviet tanks rolled into Harbin, Unit 731 had become a ghost, its buildings empty shells, its secrets buried under ash. But secrets don't stay buried. The Soviets quickly discovered remnants of the program, interrogating Japanese prisoners of war who whispered of atrocities beyond imagination. In 1949, the Soviets staged the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, where captured scientists admitted to human experimentation and biological warfare. Details of frostbite tests, plague bombs, vivisections all came spilling out. The world should have been outraged. The world should have demanded justice. But the world was already moving into a new conflict, the Cold War. And in Washington, men in dark suits saw not only horror in Ishii's work, but opportunity. American intelligence officers quietly struck a deal with General Ishii and many of his top staff. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii handed over his data, the results of experiments performed on thousands of unwilling human subjects. To the U.S. military, still reeling from war and bracing for confrontation with the Soviet Union, this information was priceless, knowledge gained without having to stain American hands. And so, Ishii and his scientists walked free. Many returned to comfortable lives in Japan. Some went on to hold prestigious academic and medical positions. Ishii himself lived quietly until his death in 1959, never facing a single day in court for the atrocities he masterminded. Meanwhile, the victims remained voiceless. Survivors of infected villages carried scars and sickness for the rest of their lives. Families of the disappeared never learned what happened behind the walls of Harbin. For decades, the Japanese government denied the existence of Unit 731, erasing it from textbooks, refusing to acknowledge it even as evidence mounted. Only in the late 20th century did fragments of the truth begin to surface, through testimony, declassified documents, and the courage of those who refused to let history forget. Today, the ruins of Unit 731 still stand on the outskirts of Harbin. Crumbling brick buildings, rusted gates, and abandoned tunnels remain as silent witnesses. The ground beneath them is soaked in the memory of thousands who entered and never left. Museums and memorials tell their story now, but the shadows remain heavy. Unit 731 is remembered not only for the cruelty of its experiments, but for what followed: the silence, the secrecy, the willingness of nations to bury truth for power. It stands as a reminder that science, stripped of ethics, can become the sharpest weapon of all. That men who swear oaths to heal can be turned into executioners. That war doesn't just destroy cities and armies, it destroys morality itself. The victims of Unit 731 never had names inside those walls. They were logs, objects, test material. But history has given them back their humanity. They were mothers, fathers, children, neighbors. They were lives stolen in the name of progress, erased in the name of empire. And their voices, silenced in Harbin, now echo across time. A warning that when secrecy, ambition, and cruelty converge, humanity itself can be the first casualty.
In the chaos of the Second World War, As Europe burned and the Pacific became a battlefield of islands, another war was unfolding in the shadows. It was a war not fought with tanks or planes, but with glass vials, scalpels, and whispered commands behind locked doors. This war began in the frigid wilderness of Manchuria, a region Japan had seized from China years earlier. Here, away from the eyes of the world, the Japanese Imperial Army built something that would remain one of history's darkest secrets for decades. It was called Unit 731. Officially, it was described as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. On paper, it sounded harmless, even noble. A medical unit tasked with protecting soldiers from disease and ensuring clean water supplies. But in reality, it was a fortress of horror. A massive compound stretching across more than 6 square kilometers, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and a silence so complete it was as if the land itself refused to speak of what went on inside. The man behind it was General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but fanatical microbiologist. Ishii was ambitious, arrogant, and utterly devoted to Japan's vision of imperial dominance. He believed that biological warfare, diseases unleashed as weapons, would give Japan an unstoppable edge in its conquest of Asia. To achieve this, he needed a laboratory unlike any the world had ever seen, a place where science could advance without limits, without questions, without morality. And so, in the early 1930s, construction began outside the city of Harbin, in northeastern China. The locals watched uneasily as the Japanese military seized land, erected tall walls, and built sprawling complexes of red brick buildings. Rumors spread. This was no water purification plant. Something else was happening inside, something darker. By the late 1930s, Unit 731 was fully operational. Its grounds contained laboratories, barracks, workshops, and holding cells. There were underground chambers, incinerators, even a special railway to deliver prisoners in secrecy. It was a self-contained city of death, designed for one purpose: to turn living humans into test subjects. But Ishii and his colleagues needed bodies, and they had an endless supply. In occupied China, resistance fighters, peasants, criminals, and anyone accused of defying Japanese rule could vanish overnight. Entire families disappeared. These people were transported in locked trains, taken through iron gates, and never seen again. Inside the compound, they were given a new name, Maruta. It means logs. The scientists of Unit 731 did not call them men, women, or children. They were not fathers, mothers, or sons. They were logs, objects, material to be used and discarded. And that was the first step in the horror, the stripping away of humanity. Every detail of Unit 731 was shrouded in secrecy. Guards had orders to shoot anyone who approached without clearance. Scientists and doctors were sworn to silence, their families threatened if they spoke. Prisoners were never listed, never recorded by name, only by number. When new logs arrived, they were marched into holding cells, their heads shaved, their clothes replaced with rough uniforms, their identities erased. From the outside, it looked like just another military base. Inside, it was a laboratory built on human suffering. Here, Japan was preparing for a future war of unimaginable scale. not only against China, but against the Soviet Union, against the West, against anyone who stood in the way of their empire. And at the center of that plan was Ishii's dream to unleash plague, cholera, anthrax, and countless other diseases as weapons of war. Unit 731 was not a medical facility. It was a factory of death, a fortress where morality was suspended, where doctors became executioners, and where the line between science and savagery ceased to exist. This was the beginning. The gates of Harbin had closed, and behind them, one of the darkest chapters of human history was about to unfold. If you enjoyed today's video, we thank you very much. Please like and subscribe to Rare Breed Chronicles. And let's dive into another story that defies the ordinary.